Okay, so here are my slides. And before we go any further, if you're wondering what this little thing here is, this is my microphone that I started to use. It's a fancy smancy way to improve the audio quality. Ignore it going forward, okay? So the slides here really are designed to introduce you to this question of what is this course about? What is environmental law? And just like any other course that you encounter in law school, the course is about the laws, the statutes, the regulations, and doctrines, principles governing environmental issues like chemicals and toxic substances, pollution emissions from power plants, from cars, from industrial facilities, waste management from factories, even waste that you and I produce as part of our daily living. Most of that's, however, regulated not by the federal government, but rather by municipal government. And really how we as a society, how companies, how commercial entities exploit and use living and non-living natural resources. What are those? Living would be things like wildlife, fisheries, activities like hunting, fishing, as well as forests, logging. Non-living resources, mining activities for metal ores, gold, silver, iron, as well as things like coal or oil and gas. That's really all part and parcel of environmental law. Ultimately, the objective is, of course, to ensure the sustainable use of land, of the media, the land, water, air that surrounds us, and of the natural ecosystem, because it is clear that we as humans depend and need clean, healthy environment in order to live well. So just to illustrate then, what does this really mean? Right? And I want to show you and tell you just about a few really high-profile cases that have occurred over the last decade. The Volkswagen Dieselgate case. Dieselgate like Watergate, diesel, because this involved diesel vehicles by Volkswagen. A huge, huge fraud. Most of you will probably not know since you're too young, but there was an advertising campaign that Volkswagen at one point had run, advertising its diesel vehicles as green and clean. And it turns out that the only reason why they were able to meet pollution control standards, air pollution standards by the US government is because they were fraudulently, they were making up test results, and they were essentially hiding and concealing pollution from federal regulators and especially also from the California state environmental regulators. They got wind of this in it anyway, and a criminal trial, a civil enforcement action ensued, and Volkswagen ultimately had to pay not only more than $4 billion in civil penalties under the Clean Air Act, and 4.3 billion with a B, not with an M, one of the largest penalties ever assessed against a corporation. But Volkswagen ultimately also had to plead guilty to 3 felony counts, including obstruction of justice. As part of that criminal guilty plea, Volkswagen was sentenced to a $2.8 billion fine, criminal fine, and sentenced to 3 years of probation. 3 years probation. Imagine that, a corporation essentially being criminally liable. A number of the engineers, Volkswagen engineers that have been involved in this fraud ended up going to jail. Right? So one of the biggest criminal cases in this country's history involved in environmental issues. The other big environmental case of this decade was the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This happened in 2010, just a little bit more than 10 years ago. Huge disaster, blowout of the Macondo well that BP had been drilling. Huge disaster because it blew out, and of course the escaping gas and oil then exploded. 11 oil rig workers were killed, 17 more injured, and more huge amounts of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, killing lots of wildlife, fish, destroying fisheries, contaminating the oceans, causing tremendous amount of economic damage to the tourism industry, to the fishing industry, and of course to the, causing harm to the beaches and natural ecosystem. The case that was filed by the Justice Department ended up with a criminal guilty plea by BP for BP pled guilty to 11 counts of felony manslaughter for the deaths of those oil rig workers, and had to pay $4 billion, again, billion with a B, $1 billion in criminal fines. BP also paid on the order of $5.5 billion in civil penalties and more than $9 billion in resource damages. The amounts of money that were assessed that BP ended up paying, mind-blowing. Of course, nowadays with the economic stimulus, billion here, billion there, doesn't seem to be so big. But I just want to emphasize to you that some of the biggest cases in US history have been environmental cases. All right, we will touch on these cases, but what else? If you care not so much about the birds and the bees and the fish and the bunnies, if you care about social justice, environmental law should also be something that might interest you. And one example is the Flint, Michigan water crisis. In Flint, Michigan, a community, a city that has a very large portion of racial minorities, of poor people, essentially state and local government officials ignored problems of water contamination, lead contamination in the drinking water for almost a year and a half. It wasn't until public health officers, until physicians sounded the alarm bell that state officials, that federal officials finally started to pay attention, and not for another year until some sort of significant progress was reported by researchers. But this particular disaster, this really unfortunate event, has had long, long consequences for the children in Flint, Michigan. Lead contamination, as you might, some of you might know, is a neurotoxin. Lead is a neurotoxin and causes development delays in children, especially brain development, and therefore has causes lifelong harm to those who are affected by lead contamination. This is an ongoing problem, and a problem that's replicated in many communities that are poor, that are racial minority, or that are marginalized for that matter in other ways. Environmental justice continues to be one of the overriding challenges of our environmental regulatory system. It's an issue that I've been interested in for many years. All right, let me go on to one other sort of defining question, really, that question that all of you, I think, are familiar with, and that is climate change. Climate change is an existential threat to our civilization in that not only will it change weather and have serious impacts on natural ecosystem, but because of sea level rise, because it's changing weather, because it is affecting and making ecosystems less productive, it will have adverse effects on things that we depend on. Our agricultural systems, drought, severe weather, shifting temperature zones will make food production more precarious, create problems, heat waves, tropical diseases, all sorts of things that will have significant effects on humanity. Now, the good news is that the international community has been working on this. The picture there is that of the successful adoption or a conclusion of the negotiations of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. I'm sorry, the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement that is at this point the most important of the climate change treaties that the world is working with. Now, climate change, of course, we usually think of rising sea levels causing lots of problems, inundating small islands. But climate change also has effects and is likely to have serious consequences in our own backyard. Here in California, of course, what I'm referring to is the drought. Here's an image. While cause and effect is difficult to ascribe, certainly droughts and changing weather patterns and climate are expected with climate change. With climate change. And therefore, it has been of great concern to climatologists and of course environmentalists here in the state of California. All right. So here is a set of key questions that we will be tackling in our course. Assuming that there is an environmental problem, as I hope you will agree, there are many. Should the response always be legal in nature? It's a question I think that is worth really reflecting on. In law school, we are of course teaching you to be lawyers, and so if you have a hammer, the law, everything seems to look like a nail. And of course, not every problem is a nail. Sometimes you have to, sometimes whatever the thing that you're trying to work with is a screw or something else, and so the best tool may not in fact be a hammer. Really what I'm trying to get at is that maybe some environmental problems are best solved by voluntary action, by lobbying, by looking to ourselves to change our behavior in finding solutions. But when the law is relevant, of course, lawyers have an important role to play. And the second question that arises that we won't spend a lot of time on, but some, is who should respond. Environmental law is an area of public law, and so the premise usually is that the government, state and federal, have an important role. But in the environmental statutory context, citizen groups, environmental groups have given a special role to step in and enforce the law when the federal government, the state governments have failed to do so. Right? Citizen suits used to be a unique aspect of American environmental law. Not so much anymore, but it remains hugely important because it gives an important role to environmental NGOs like NRDC, the Natural Resource Defense Council, or of course the premier public interest environmental law firm, Earth Justice. And finally, what legal tools should be used if the law is relevant? And this is the question that we're going to spend most of our time on. We're going to be covering a number of the major environmental statutes, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and a couple others, and ask how they regulate and how they can be used as tools to respond to environmental issues. Right? I'm almost done with my slide here. Let me show you just a final set of thoughts. Now, I know that some of you hope to become environmental law practitioners, to become environmental law specialists. But I also know that many of you may be in this course just because you have some general interest in environmental issues. Maybe you just want to learn more about environmental law, and you are not planning to be environmental law specialists. You plan to have a general commercial practice. Maybe you want to be a corporate lawyer. It is nevertheless relevant. Or maybe, just maybe, you're in this course because you think Professor Yang is so good looking and so funny that you can't wait to take another course. I'm kidding. But my point really is, for whatever reason you're taking environmental protection law, I think you will get quite a bit out of it. If you're going to be a specialist, of course, there are lots of paths into it, whether as a private practitioner or corporate counsel specializing in environmental health and safety issues in a large corporation, dealing with compliance issues, for example, or if you're in a private firm litigating, defending a company against an enforcement action. If you work for the government, working to advise federal agencies, or litigating, bringing enforcement action, or writing regulations. And finally, of course, you could be in a public interest practice, working for an environmental NGO, again, litigating on behalf of citizen groups, or lobbying, or trying to shape public policy. But even, again, if you're not, your path into the legal career, if your path into the law is not as an environmental specialist, you will find environmental law not only rewarding, but hugely practically useful. Virtually every corporation will come into contact and will be subject to environmental regulations and face compliance issues. You may not need to be a specialist in order to help your corporation, but you will need to know when environmental legal issues, when compliance issues come up, when there is a risk to your client because they may be in violation if they take certain steps. This course will help you evaluate that and alert you and make you aware of those issues. So because of the broad-ranging nature of environmental regulation, this can help you be a well-rounded and well-equipped lawyer. Now, how do you get into, how do you explore some of these substantive areas? Well, take more courses, of course. I've listed a few, whether it's land use, energy law, international environmental law, but also try to take administrative law, something that's actually quite valuable for any practice that deals with federal agency, because administrative law essentially is the law dealing with the obligations, the authority, and the limitations that federal agencies act under. Think about study abroad programs like Singapore and Sydney, which specifically have significant environmental components. And then think about also internship experiences that allow you to explore and get some practical skills, including some of the Santa Clara clinics. And finally, of course, consider participating in the Environmental Law Society.